Well, good morning. Last week, Doc started a sermon series looking through the book of Proverbs. And, we talked about Proverbs as kind of offering all these different pieces of wisdom on how to live. And Doc started this series out of the book of Proverbs with a verse from Psalms. And I don't know if anybody gave him a hard time about that. And I think you should have. But since he can do it, I'm going to do it too, all right? So today we're gonna start in the book of Philippians, and I'm like not even going Old Testament, all right? Like I'm going New Testament. This is from Paul. He writes to the Philippian church, and he says, I've learned the secret. I've learned the secret. That's kind of the good stuff, right? Makes you lean forward a little bit. We all like to know a good secret. Paul thinks he has one here. Kind of makes us lean forward, right? What does Paul know that I need to know? What's this secret? Paul says, I've learned the secret to being content. Feels a little bit like a letdown, right? Like really? Like that's it? Is that a secret that you've been trying to discover? Have you been actively pursuing contentment? You probably have, right? Like I think we all want contentment. I don't know if we would use those words to explain it, but we don't really even live like it. We live like contentment exists just around the corner from where we're at, and we're chasing it. And then we get around the corner only to find that it's turned the next corner, right? It's just always kind of out of reach. Instead of ever becoming content, we just become craving more and more. And that's kind of the American dream, right? More, bigger, better, the American dream. You know that there's a crisis on our border right now with people trying to get into our country because of the American dream. They view us as wealthy. They view us as a success story. The rest of the world is watching us, and they want contentment like we have contentment. Except that we know that we don't have contentment. I think we've become content in our discontentment. I think we're satisfied to just keep chasing the next thing. And now, like here we are in church. We're going to talk about money. And there's some real issues with that, isn't there? Instantly, there's walls that are going to go up. There's a lot of people who think that the Bible is just this old book that's been used for centuries to actually take people's money. Some of you are thinking, oh no, a church is going to tell me that I have to give them my money. Sounds like another one of these church schemes, right? And it doesn't take long to jump on Google and find the latest stories of pastors who've stolen money from people. In fact, I won't even make you look. I'll give you 3. There's a guy out in Colorado. He created his own version of cryptocurrency for his church. Told him to invest in it. He took about $1 million and remodeled his home. There's another story of an executive pastor who stole around $130,000 because he had gambling debts. It's a little bit shady, right? Then there's another pastor who had taken over authority of a disabled man's estate. He kind of became like the power of attorney. And since he had access to the guy's finances and was in charge of everything, the pastor just began taking from this disabled man. Says he did it for his church. Still shady, right? These stories exist. All too often they exist. And now you're going to sit in a room where a pastor stands on stage and talks about money. Who do I think I am, right? But what if this is a big deal to God? And why is it a big deal to God? What if Paul was serious when he said that he learned the secret to being content? And what if it's true? And what if headlines like these that we've looked at, what if these aren't revealing the brokenness of God's church, but they're actually revealing the brokenness of people? What if God's word is actually giving us warnings to not become these very stories? And what if God's word tells us exactly how our hearts can so very easily become filled with greed? What if God cares about our hearts and he has some things to tell us about money? What if it's a big deal to God? Doc started last week with a couple foundational proverbs. He talked about kids, and he used a couple proverbs that didn't have anything to do with raising kids, at least at first glance. We're going to do the same thing this week because there's some pieces of wisdom that are going to touch every part of life. And these 2 verses that we're starting with are just as relevant when we talk about money as they are when we talk about raising kids. The first one's from Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. It says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And here's a huge qualifier for you if you're in the room, if you're maybe new to all this, if maybe you don't follow Jesus. Here's a big qualifier. If you don't fear God, you don't have to believe any of this. Everything that we talk about this morning, if you don't fear God, then this isn't for you. Everything that we're going to talk about this morning is actually going to sound like complete nonsense. In fact, this is so wild. Like the things that God's going to teach us here, that he gives us through the book of Proverbs, is going to be so wild, so countercultural, that even people who do fear God are going to have a hard time believing some of this stuff. But if there is no God, who cares what you do with your money? Who cares how you spend your time pursuing more wealth? If there is no God, then there's no reason to care for anything except yourself. So simply put, if you don't fear God, who cares how you spend your money? However, I dare you to try it. I dare you to take these pieces of wisdom and try it. I dare you to consider some of it. You don't have to believe in God to do wise things. Wisdom starts with the fear of God, but it's not reserved just for Jesus followers. Anyone can do wise things. And so I dare you to listen. I dare you to try it. The second verse that Doc used last week that we're going to start with again today is Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. Solomon says, above all else, guard your heart, for it is the wellspring of life. Wisdom that comes from the fear of God is going to tell you to guard your heart. Because there are tons of things out there in this world that would love to distract you, or they would love to deceive you, or they would love to dethrone God from your heart. And money is one of the most dangerous heart killers in the world, and especially within our culture. Money is one of, if not the biggest challenger to God's throne in our hearts. And so if there's any part of you, if there's anything within you that desires to fear God, or maybe you don't want to fear God, but if there's any part of you that desires to live a wise life, like maybe life hasn't been going the way that you wanted it to, or if there's any part of you that wants to fear God or you want to live a better life, I want you to hear this right off the bat. You need to guard your heart. You better guard your heart. Now, there's a lot of wisdom that Proverbs gives us about money and wealth, and some of it's just simple, straightforward kind of stuff. There's some tips on debt and investing and hard work, all sorts of stuff like that. And if you remember, Proverbs is kind of like God's Twitter account. It's short, simple, straightforward pieces of wisdom. We kind of refer to it as shotgun wisdom, right? Because there's just a whole lot of spread, and none of it really has to do with each other. If you read through Proverbs, it's just one idea after another, just different stuff, not any of it really linking together. It's not something you would read where there's one big idea pulling it together. But there are some big themes throughout the book where different little statements that are kind of unique where they're at connect to other ideas that are throughout the rest of the book. So there's these themes, there's these ideas that kind of pop up. There's a few threads like this. Solomon frequently compares wealth with other virtues that are more important. Meaning, and you're going to find in Proverbs, that wealth is a good thing, but it's not the best thing. That there's other things that are more important than wealth. There's lots of virtues that we will ignore in pursuit of wealth, in pursuit of money, right? And that wealth isn't the most important thing. It actually impairs other virtues in our life. And so we're going to look at 5 different things that we find in Proverbs, 5 different virtues that are superior to wealth. And I bet on the front end, I bet that you will believe the statements. When we start out, I bet you're going to believe it, I bet you're going to buy it, but I bet you don't live like it. Which kind of challenges whether or not you really believe it to begin with, right? 5 things that I think you believe, but you don't really believe, but you think you do. Starting with this. Wealth isn't everything. Wealth doesn't satisfy. Wealth doesn't satisfy. It's that word contentment again. And you probably believe that. You probably believe that wealth doesn't satisfy, but you don't really live like it. Probably. The average American family spends more money than it makes. We're constantly buying more furniture and more tools or more cars or houses or boats, whether we can afford them or not. If we can't afford it, it doesn't even stop us. One of the more significant philosophers of our time, Ariana Grande, that was a joke, okay? She puts it this way. She says, I see it, I like it, I want it, I got it. And that's how we live, right? Some of you know exactly, man. Doc has never quoted Ariana Grande, all right? Can I get some appreciation for that? That's how we live, though, right? It's how we think. We're constantly looking for the next thing to buy so that we can be content, and we just never get there. Proverbs speaks about that. Chapter 30, verse 8 and 9 says, give me enough food to live, neither too much nor too little. If I'm too full, I might get independent, saying, God, who needs him? If I'm poor, I might steal and dishonor the name of my God. There's another one from Ecclesiastes 5, and I know that's not Proverbs, okay, but it's the same guy Solomon writing, and it's very proverb-ish. It is a proverb, it's just in a different place. It's shotgun wisdom. He says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Accumulation of wealth doesn't resolve all of life's challenges, does it? And you know it's true. You may not live like it, but you know it's true. There's always going to be something more to crave. There's always going to be something more to have. There's always going to be something that's just out of reach. It's living in that way where we turn a corner thinking that we can finally catch up to something, this thing that we've been chasing, only to see that whatever we're chasing is around the next corner. And I think it's why it's so significant that Paul says what he does in Philippians 4, where we started. He says, I've learned the secret to being content. So what is the secret? What's the answer? It's a famous verse that you probably have memorized. Even if you don't believe in Jesus, even if you don't go to church, even if you haven't read the Bible, you probably have this verse memorized. You probably know it. It's Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. I can do everything through him who gives me strength. We misuse that verse so much. We use it in all sorts of ways that it wasn't intended to be used. It's not what Paul's saying. What he is saying is that contentment comes through trusting God to take care of you, as opposed to trusting yourself to take care of you or your wealth. We think to ourselves, I can work and I can accumulate wealth and then I'm going to be taken care of just fine. And yet we're chasing something that's elusive. We never quite get there. It's always just out of reach. Contentment is never quite in my ability to grab. Paul knows the secret. It's trusting God. It's trusting that he's going to take care of you, not your wealth, not your ability to gain wealth. But it's not just about contentment. We talk about wealth doesn't satisfy, contentment is an issue. 2, wealth is inferior to wisdom. It's inferior to wisdom. And you probably believe it, but you probably don't live like it. If I had $100 right now and I offered you a $100 bill or a piece of wisdom that might change your life, you would take the $100 bill. Pretty confident about that. Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you would turn that down, but I bet you have a price. I bet there's a number that you would choose instead of wisdom. What would it take? Proverbs 8 says, prefer my life disciplines over chasing after money and God knowledge over a lucrative career. What he's saying is pursue knowing God's knowledge. Have God's wisdom. Pursue that instead of your own ability to just build your own wealth. He says, because wisdom is better than all the trappings of wealth. Nothing you could wish for holds a candle to her. And this is a warning. Solomon gives a strong warning here that having wealth and not having wisdom is a very dangerous situation to be in. We want wealth so badly that sometimes we do it at the expense of wisdom. Solomon calls that a trap. This is dangerous. And you know it's true because you've seen the stories of the professional athletes or the entertainers who've made millions and now they're broke. They had wealth and they didn't have wisdom and now they have neither. And it's easy for us to look outward and it's easy to see other people's problems, but this one applies to us in the room because we live in one of the wealthiest nations in human history. And that means that we may be living in one of the biggest traps in human history. We are surrounded by wealth. You better protect your heart. You've got to guard your heart. You've got to make sure that you're pursuing wisdom. If you get wealth, that's cool, but let it follow you. Don't let it be your pursuit. Pursue what is wise and let whatever wealth may come follow. Pursue wisdom. So 1, wealth is inferior to contentment. It doesn't satisfy. 2, wealth is inferior to wisdom. 3, wealth is inferior to righteousness. And you probably believe that to be true, but you probably don't live like it. Proverbs chapter 10 says, ill-gotten gain gets you nowhere. An honest life is immortal. Our world is filled with wealthy people who use shady tactics to gain wealth. And we call them success stories. And then we elect them as presidents. It's true, isn't it? It's true of Trump. It's true of Biden. You're going to be hard-pressed to name a president who didn't have ill-gotten gain. And we would press back, right? We would press back against this idea that it doesn't get you anywhere, because observation of our world would tell you that wealth gets you everything you want and everywhere you want to be. And so we pursue wealth, even if it takes us into some shady, gray areas. And so maybe you make up some loopholes when it comes to your taxes. Maybe you intentionally accumulate some debt before you have to claim bankruptcy. Maybe it's as simple as just kind of like fudging your own time cards, right? Solomon tells us that an honest life is better. In fact, he calls it immortal. That's weird, right? That's a weird word to use here. Solomon says that the day is coming when wealth won't get you everything you want and everywhere you want to be. And you may not be concerned about it today, but there's going to be a day where you will be deeply concerned about it. And on that day, you will trade all of it for righteousness. And that's a big, weird, churchy word, righteousness, right? It just means being able to stand before God and not be condemned. Solomon is saying that there's going to come a day when you're going to wish that the only thing you owned was righteousness. You could have spent your entire life pursuing wealth and trying to have as much as you possibly could, but the day is coming when you would trade absolutely all of it for righteousness, and it's available to you for free. We have righteousness through Jesus. This doesn't fit our world very well, does it? But it's almost like our world isn't on the way to heaven. Pursue righteousness, not wealth. Wealth is inferior to contentment. It doesn't satisfy. 2, wealth is inferior to wisdom. 3, wealth is inferior to righteousness. And 4, wealth is inferior to humility. And you probably believe it, but you probably don't live like it. Proverbs 16:19 says, it's better to live humbly among the poor than to live it up among the rich and the famous. And you know what? Never mind. I don't think any of us believe this. I don't think any of us believe this. I don't think we believe it at all. No one is clamoring to live among the poor. There isn't a movement among the rich and famous to give it all away. I don't know anyone who's aggressively pursuing a more humble way to live. I mean, how many people do you know who are intentionally downsizing? How many people do you know who are selling everything they own? How many people do you know who are going into the mission field? How many people do you know who are giving the majority of their income away? I don't think we believe this. I don't think we believe that wealth is inferior to humility. But refusing to believe it doesn't make it less true. God's wisdom says, let others throw their life away in pursuit of wealth. You don't have to follow. Be satisfied in humility. Jesus actually backs this up. He says it this way in Matthew 23. He says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And that's different, right? I mean, for real, pursue humility, live humbly, give away the position of prestige. These are weird ideas. These are countercultural ideas. But God's wisdom is different than our wisdom, and we believe it's better than our wisdom. I actually think that he's smarter than me. I think that there's a chance that he knows things I don't know. And there's a time when it kind of feels like you just have to trust in some of this, right? God's wisdom seems to say that a humble life is better. That a humble life and a humble heart is more in line with our God and who he is, and it's a better way to live. So Solomon's telling us, guys, pay attention here. You let God make you rich in what matters eternally. So pursue humility. Let God handle the rest. And that's a tough one. 1, wealth is inferior to contentment. It doesn't satisfy. Wealth is inferior to wisdom. Wealth is inferior to righteousness. Inferior to humility. Number 5, wealth is inferior to relationships, to good relationships, friendships. And you probably believe this one, but I don't know if you live like it. Proverbs 15, verse 17 says, better a bread crust shared in love than a slab of prime rib served in hate. This is all of these ones that I've been using have been from the Message version. I especially like this one. I really wanted to point this out because you're probably not going to find prime rib in the Greek, in the Bible. Like, it doesn't exist, okay? But you should know, I really like prime rib. Like, I really like it. It is literally my favorite meal. I get gluttonous with prime rib. My wife has scolded me before because of how I eat prime rib. Okay, like it's serious. I turn eating into a sin with prime rib. Okay, I can't emphasize this enough. It's a big deal to me. Never, never, never would I trade prime rib for bread crust. Like, it's not going to happen, okay? And in fact, you could sit across from me while I'm eating prime rib, and you could say whatever hateful, hurtful things you want to me. I'm going to be just fine. I'm eating prime rib. It doesn't matter, okay? So what's going on here? Simple question. Would you give up the signs of wealth, in this case specifically prime rib, would you give up the signs of wealth for a good friendship? Would you rather have a fancy dinner among people who hate you or breadcrumbs with those who love you? And I know that we struggle with this one because we envision a scenario where we have everything we want. But you know this is true. You've heard the stories of the people who had all the money, all the wealth, all the success, and were surrounded with just all the fame and the fortune of everybody around them, and then they realized that they were surrounded by people who didn't love them. And they were surrounded by people who were using them. And they were surrounded by people who didn't care about them, and they were miserable. You see, we treat wealth like it's an end-all, be-all, but it just can't compete with a good friend. Turn the formula around. How much would you sell your best friend for? That's a fun question. Might want to text them later, let them know what the price is. How much would it take for you to choose to lose your best friend? If you have a good friend, I think like of a spouse, maybe for ladies, maybe your sister. I think of the close friendships that exist in that. If you have a really good friend, there probably isn't a dollar amount. They are beyond value to you. So Solomon says, pursue that. Pursue the relationships. Don't get hung up on the wealth. Pursue your friendships. Guys, the big idea here is money isn't everything. There's a long list of virtues that are better than wealth. Contentment, wisdom, righteousness, humility, friendship. They're all superior to wealth, and all we can think about is money. Other virtues being superior it's a big theme in Proverbs. There's another one that I want us to hit just real quickly. One of the common themes that you're going to find throughout the whole book of Proverbs, just keeps coming up over and over again, is the competition between greed and giving. I'm talking about generosity. And what's interesting is that as you read through Proverbs, there's all sorts of wisdom into how to build wealth. Building wealth is encouraged if done in a healthy way, not from a place of greed, not from a heart of greed. And so you're going to find statements of wisdom about hard work and debt and investing. Wealth isn't evil, but guard your heart, because greed can become this beast within you that when fed just grows out of control. Let me show you. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 19 says, such are the paths of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It takes away the life of those who get it. It's a huge warning. That what you gain in wealth, you might lose in life. It's a very strong warning. Jesus takes it a step further in Matthew 16. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit his soul? It's possible to dominate this life and accumulate the most stuff, and at the end of it be in absolute poverty of soul. I can back that up. It's Proverbs chapter 22. Communicates this very idea. One who opposes the poor to increase his wealth and one who gives gifts to the rich both come to poverty. Oppressing those in need, seeking the favor of the rich, both lead to poverty. We don't believe that because this one isn't true. This isn't true at all, is it? We look around the world and we can see people who've gained wealth, people who have extreme wealth at the expense of those in poverty. And they've used their money to gain influence with other people who have great wealth. And they've increased their own success, right? And it's a great strategy for wealth. And it's a great way to become highly successful. This proverb is absolutely wrong. Unless he's not talking about money. Unless he's talking about the heart and the soul. That it's possible to gain this whole world and have absolute wealth and be absolutely poverty-stricken of heart and soul. And there's so many more proverbs dealing with greed. One of the main themes concerning money is the temptation to become obsessed with it. It's this beast, and when we feed it just a little bit, it begins to grow, and it grows until it's out of control, and it quickly becomes your master. It's so very dangerous. It's one of the greatest dangers our hearts face. That's why we have to guard our hearts. So what's the solution? How do you combat greed? It's through giving. And it goes right along with all of your preconceived assumptions about the church. Here it is, right? The church is getting ready to ask for all your money. Listen to me, guys. This isn't about who receives your gifts or what institution receives your gifts. These wise sayings from Proverbs aren't about your responsibility to give to the church. This is about the work that you and God are doing on your heart. And giving is the practice of refusing to let money or wealth become the master of my heart. Proverbs 11 says, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. I want you to follow this line of thinking with me. Generosity is a virtue that God has. And so when I practice generosity, I'm practicing being like God. And when I refresh others with my generosity, God's made a commitment to refresh me. That there's a blessing that takes place. So when I'm giving, I'm protecting my heart from greed. I'm squashing this beast down within me that wants more by giving instead of keeping and hoarding for myself. I'm fighting against this beast that's within me. And God blesses people. This is a huge idea. God blesses people who treat people like God treats people. God is generous to people. When I'm generous to people, God blesses me. And it's not necessarily going to be financial. This isn't a promise that God will give you more than you can give. But you will find abundant blessings in your life when you fight this thing within you to crave more and instead work to give. And I know it sounds crazy. But you've experienced this. You've seen the joy that comes in helping someone else, and you've seen generous people at the end of their life have zero regrets about their generosity. And this is wild, but God isn't wrong. Proverbs 14 says it's a sin to despise one's neighbor, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. God doesn't despise, he blesses. He particularly cares about those in need. So if I give for the sake of protecting my heart from this greed monster that wants to grow in me, then I'm going to give. And then God begins to bless people who treat people like God treats people. That's the pattern here. Proverbs 28 says, those who give to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them receive many curses. God's math is different than our math. His wisdom is different than our wisdom. His currency is different than our currency. And God's math says that those who give are not going to be found wanting. Those who give to the poor will lack nothing. And that may sound weird to you, but God's math is different. When I give, I'm protecting my heart from this greed monster, and God blesses people who treat people like God treats people. God calls for his people to be generous with money. There's a spot from Paul again in the New Testament. He writes to the Corinthian church where he says that God loves a cheerful giver. And it's not because God wants your money. It's not because God needs your money. It's not because God's church needs your money. It's because you need God to rule your heart. You need your heart to be transformed to be more like his. And this isn't about tithing. This isn't about supporting the church. This is about the fact that when you give, it makes you healthier. It really, truly makes your heart healthy. It's an antidote for greed. And I know that some of you may be thinking that you aren't wealthy, so this doesn't apply to you. Some of you may be thinking that you don't have enough to be able to give. This isn't about how much you have. This isn't stuff just for the rich. This is about how much you give. This is for the rich and the poor. This is for those who have much and those who have little, because all of us have a heart and all of us have a need to have our heart transformed into God's heart. So start the practice and the discipline of generosity. What's interesting to me is that you're never going to feel like being generous. Maybe you do. There's some people who have that gift. But for most of us, it's not an internally motivated kind of a thing. It's a discipline. It must be trained and practiced over time. It takes discipline to pursue contentment instead of wealth, or wisdom, righteousness, humility, friendships. It takes discipline to pursue those virtues over wealth. It takes discipline to fight against the greed that is inside of you that will naturally grow and win if you don't fight against it. It takes discipline to be generous. So let's practice. We're going into a time of communion and offering. At the worship stations around the room, there's boxes for our Cap City family. We never have any expectation that if you're not part of this family, that you would give in that kind of a way. It's not an expectation that you give, but it is an opportunity for you to practice generosity, what we're talking about today. I want you to pray over how you give and what you give and talk to God about it. Check on your heart. Maybe you give online. I do. That's how I go about it. And sometimes it's easy to just forget and to just let it be a simple little thing, a transaction that happens between my bank account and the church. Take this time to pray over what you give. Talk to God about your heart. Are you being generous the way that God has been generous with you? Because that's the focal point of this time as we go to the tables. It's the bread and the juice. That's a constant reminder of God's generosity to us. It's the body and the blood of Jesus, the ultimate gift, the ultimate sign of generosity to you. So talk to him. Check your heart. Start by giving a little. Try it. Give your first part back to God. Put something extra in the generous bucket. Make it a goal to grow in your giving. More than anything, can you pursue generosity? Can you recognize that God is doing a work on your heart, and that's what's most important to him? It's challenging, it's hard, it's going to call us out of some places of comfort. Are you willing to try it? Are you willing to talk to him? Why don't you stand? Let's go to the tables.